I was in parts of the north of England last week, so on the so-called no-go zones, speaking with women in particular whose lives have been ruined in some cases by the installation and the propulsion increase of Sharia law in this country. It's a question of whether or not they have volunteered. I don't think the state can make that.
You are about to witness Douglas School, this liberal human rights lawyer, that he ended up agreeing with him on why embracing Sharia law is actually a very bad idea. The left-wing media has succeeded in brainwashing people like him to think that it is a good idea to embrace the dangerous Sharia law in the UK.
Is the legal code based on the Islamic holy book, the Quran, which governs how Muslims live their everyday lives. There are no official Sharia courts in the UK, but there are councils and tribunals which are used to settle civil disputes. And the government announced in the summer for the first time that some of these hearings now operate under the Arbitration Act. That means their rulings are enforceable through the UK court system.
The explanation given by the host alone should send shivers down your spine. The idea of embracing Sharia law in the UK is deeply troubling. Sharia law fundamentally contradicts the core values and the principles upon which Western legal systems are built. The Quranic legal code, while significant to Muslims, often imposes strict laws that are incompatible with the freedoms and rights we hold dear, particularly concerning gender equality and individual liberties. Allowing Sharia councils and tribunals to operate under the Arbitration Act is a dangerous precedent. It risks creating a parallel legal system that undermines the unity and integrity of our national laws. We must stand firm against any encroachment that could change the foundations of our society. Our legal system must remain secular and universal, ensuring equal treatment for all, irrespective of religious affiliation.
With you as a top lawyer, how comfortable are you with Sharia being brought into the fold, as it were?
Well, comfortable-ish. It's being brought into the fold under the Human Rights Act, and you can appeal from these arbitration tribunals, which have one Muslim lawyer and one academic, to the courts, and I think that's very important. Beth Din has had this system for Jewish people for many years, and there are worries because there are aspects of Muslim law that simply are unacceptable. The dealings with women, the idea that women should inherit only half the property and that men should, their testimony is worth more than women. Those aspects of Sharia are incompatible with our legal...
But Douglas is about to let him eat his words in second, but the idea of integrating Sharia law into the UK legal system, even under the Human Rights Act, is fundamentally flawed. While proponents argue that the system allows for appeals and oversight by UK courts, the core principles of Sharia law remain incompatible with our core values and Western legal traditions. The treatment of women, for example, under Sharia, where their inheritance rights and testimonies are valued less than men's, is a direct insult to the equality and dignity that we uphold in the society. Compromising on these fundamental issues is not an option. Our legal system must remain firmly rooted in the principles of justice and equality that reflect our Christian heritage. Integrating Sharia law, even with modifications, poses a significant threat to these values and should be firmly opposed.
If one doesn't like what the Sharia arbitration suggests, there is UK law to fall back on, so what's the problem?
Well, you'd hope that there was, but sadly that doesn't seem to be always the case. The Sharia court featured in your film, the Muslim Arbitration Tribunal, has, by its own admission, heard 6 cases that really have strayed from the civil into the criminal. 6 women who were abused and who, instead of being referred to the police by the MAT, had their cases overheard by the MAT. Another case was a Muslim man who died, didn't leave a will. The MAT decided to arbitrate his will according to Sharia, so the daughters got half of the money for their brothers. So the question here is not just whether, in the words of Sadiq Khan, the MP who said last month, asked whether or not the Muslim community in Britain is sophisticated, was his word, enough to have a parallel legal system, but also who's driving it. And sadly, and I've seen this many times, spoken to people who run these courts, the people who are driving the desire for more Sharia in this country are not the progressive Muslims.
Well,
they are people who are the most regressive Muslims in the Muslim community here.
Douglas raises a crucial point about the dangers of integrating Sharia law into the UK legal system. Even with the supposed safety net of UK law, there have been instances where Sharia courts have overstepped their boundaries, handling cases that should fall under criminal law. The example of 6 abused women whose cases were handled by the Muslim Arbitration Tribunal, EMAT, instead of being referred to the police, highlights a severe failure in protecting vulnerable individuals. As Douglas rightly points out, the push for more Sharia law in the UK is not driven by progressive Muslims, but by the most regressive elements within the community. This threatens to change the moral and legal foundations of our society.
We've got to, and I go along with you to this extent.
Very briefly, Mr.
I don't
Robinson,
think there should be no involvement in the criminal law. You're quite right. The police should prosecute irrespective of any recommendation from one of these tribunals. Secondly, we need a special overseer. We need a special counsel to check that, first of all, that these cases which are in breach of the Human Rights Act, like the one you mentioned and I mentioned, of the giving women half the will, should be appealed, and to ensure that, in fact, those who are going through this parallel arbitration, which is faster than the courts, are really, the women are genuinely agreeable.
I'm going to have to bring the gavel down at that point.
What this man fails to understand is that the involvement of Sharia tribunals in matters that should be strictly under criminal law is unacceptable. He even acknowledges the need for police prosecution irrespective of tribunal recommendations, which highlights the inherent flaws in relying on Sharia law that he wants to embrace. Having a special overseer or counsel to check cases for human rights violations and ensure fair appeals is simply not enough. The core issue lies in the existence of a parallel legal system that can undermine the principles of justice and equality. Therefore, not embracing Sharia law is essential in preserving the integrity of our legal system and protecting the rights of all individuals, especially the vulnerable. Any move towards embracing Sharia law threatens the moral and legal foundations that our society is built upon.
Isn't it just too late? It's a well-rehearsed argument. We had this when we talked about faith schools. If Beth Din is allowed to exist in this country, on what premise can you say, well, you're fine, but you're not fine?
Well, in a way, it's it's an extra legal argument. Beth Din are voluntary, and you can decide whether or not to be arbitrated by them. The question I think we have to ask as a society is if we want parallel communities, which would actually be very hard for particularly women to actually volunteer for. Would the state, for instance, have any guarantee that a woman who a Sharia court said had volunteered for arbitration had volunteered for arbitration? I was in parts of the north of England last week, on the so-called no-go zones, and speaking with women in particular whose lives have been ruined in some cases by the installation and the propulsion increase of Sharia law in this country. It's a question of whether or not they have volunteered. I don't think the state can make that decision.
Okay.
Douglas's final point against embracing Sharia law raises a critical point about the potential dangers to vulnerable individuals, particularly women. The argument that these courts are voluntary falls apart when considering the pressure and coercion women might face in these communities. Douglas highlights the issue of no-go zones and the detrimental impact on women whose lives have been ruined by the enforcement of Sharia law. This is a reminder that the state cannot ensure true voluntariness in such cases. Finally, Douglas offers us the only solution possible at this moment, and a horrifying example of the consequences that await us if we don't act. Embracing Sharia law is dangerous, as it would create fragmented communities and jeopardize the principles of justice and equality that our society upholds. The state must prioritize a legal system that is unified and protects the rights of every citizen, particularly the most vulnerable. What are your thoughts on what Douglas has to say in this debate? Be sure to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments section what your thoughts are. See you in the next video.